An ordinary grocery trip turns into an unforgettable showdown when an elderly woman tells a young Latina woman to go back to Mexico. What she says next doesn't just silence the room, it changes everything. The grocery store was alive with the hum of daily errands. Shoppers pushed their carts through the aisles, some lost in thought, others chatting quietly. It was a sunny afternoon in a small neighborhood in Texas, a place where everyone seemed to know everyone. But today, the usual flow of routine would break in the most unexpected way. Near the produce section, an elderly woman, probably in her late 70s, stood adjusting her glasses. She had an air of impatience, muttering under her breath as she reached for a bag of apples. Her faded cardigan and carefully pinned silver hair gave her an unassuming look, but what followed was anything but. A young Latina woman, petite and dressed casually in a floral sundress and sandals, approached the same stand, reaching for a bag of oranges nearby. Her name was Sofia. She was calm, polite, and seemed to blend effortlessly into the flow of the store. She was texting on her phone while balancing a basket of groceries when it happened. The elderly woman turned sharply, noticing Sofia's presence, and her expression shifted. It wasn't subtle, her eyes narrowed and her lips pursed tightly. "You people don't belong here," she said loudly enough for others nearby to hear. Sofia froze, her fingers hovering over her phone. When she looked up, the woman continued, her tone sharp and cutting. "Why don't you go back to Mexico where you came from?" The air seemed to thicken. A couple of shoppers nearby stopped in their tracks, some exchanging uncomfortable glances, while others pretended not to hear. The rhythm of the store halted, replaced by an awkward silence that stretched far too long. Sofia's initial reaction was shock. Her brow furrowed, and for a moment, it looked like she might say something immediately, but she didn't. Instead, she took a slow breath, her face unreadable, as though she was weighing every possible response. The woman, still clutching her apples, stood her ground, unapologetic and firm. The tension was palpable, and everyone within earshot could feel it. A young mother quickly steered her child away, while an older man near the potatoes glanced nervously at Sofia, waiting to see what she would do. For a moment, Sofia stood completely still, her hand gripping the handle of her grocery basket. The world around her seemed to shrink, every sound in the store muffled, every face turned in her direction. The weight of the woman's words hung in the air like a bad smell no one could escape. The elderly woman didn't back down. Her stance was defiant, as though she expected no argument. She adjusted her cardigan with a huff, her chin lifted in a way that dared Sofia to respond. A young employee stacking bananas a few feet away froze mid-motion, unsure whether to step in or stay out of it. A cashier craned her neck to get a better view. The growing crowd didn't move closer, but they didn't leave either. They were witnesses now, like it or not. Sofia glanced at the woman, her face calm, but her eyes full of thought. 1,000 responses raced through her mind. She could lash out, yell, or storm off, but none of those options felt right. The tension pressed on her like a weight, but instead of breaking, she allowed herself a moment to breathe. She shifted her basket to her other hand and straightened her posture, her presence growing larger in the silence. Her voice, when it came, was calm but deliberate, cutting through the awkward atmosphere. "Ma'am," she began, her tone measured, "do you even realize what you just said?" Her question wasn't accusatory, it was reflective, almost like she was giving the woman a chance to think about her words. But the woman didn't seem interested in reflection. "I said what I said," she snapped, her voice rising. "This is my country. People like you don't belong here." That was it. A young woman near the bread aisle gasped audibly, and the quiet murmur of the crowd grew louder. Yet Sofia remained steady. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't take a step closer. Instead, she let the pause stretch, giving the woman's words a chance to settle into the ears of everyone around them. "All right," Sofia said finally, nodding slowly. Her calmness was disarming, almost unsettling in its strength. "Let's talk about that since you brought it up." The room held its breath, waiting for her response. The storm was coming, but it wasn't the kind anyone expected. Sofia shifted her weight, setting her basket down on the floor with deliberate care. Her calmness felt like gravity, pulling everyone closer, even those pretending not to listen. She fixed her gaze on the elderly woman, not with anger, but with a kind of quiet determination that made her shift uncomfortably. "You said I don't belong here," Sofia began, her voice steady but firm. "But let me tell you something about where I come from." Her words carried weight, each one spoken like it had been carefully chosen. "My family has been in this state for generations. My great-grandparents came to Texas to work the fields, to build homes, to raise children. They endured hardship, racism, and struggles you can't imagine, but they stayed. They stayed because they believed in the promise of this country, in its potential to be better." The woman's lips tightened, but she said nothing. The crowd, however, was transfixed. A man near the dairy section, who had been glancing at his phone, put it down entirely. An older couple whispered to each other but didn't look away. "My grandfather," Sofia continued, her voice gaining strength, "fought in Vietnam. He fought for a country that didn't always fight for him. He came back to signs that told him where he could and couldn't sit, what doors he could and couldn't use. But he stayed. Do you know why?" She paused, letting the question linger. "Because he believed in what this country could become, not just what it was." A hush fell over the room. Even the hum of the refrigerators seemed quieter now. "My parents," Sofia went on, her tone softening but losing none of its intensity, "taught me to work hard, to respect others, and to stand up for what's right. My mother is a nurse. She spent her life caring for people, no matter their background. My father is a teacher. He's dedicated himself to helping kids believe in themselves, to giving them the tools to succeed. They've given more to this country than they've ever taken from it." Her eyes, still locked on the elderly woman's, softened. "So, when you tell me I don't belong here, you're not just insulting me. You're insulting my family, my history, and the sacrifices that made this country what it is." The elderly woman's face flushed. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her apples. She opened her mouth as if to respond, but stopped, her words catching in her throat. Sofia took a step back, her composure unshaken. "I could have walked away," she said, addressing the entire crowd now. "But what good would that do? Ignorance doesn't get better in silence. It's up to all of us to be better than this, to be better than words like those." The weight of her words lingered, but the story wasn't over yet. The crowd's reaction would speak louder than anything else. The silence after Sofia's words was almost deafening. For a moment, no one moved. The elderly woman's face was a patchwork of emotions: anger, embarrassment, and something deeper, something that looked almost like shame. She glanced around the crowd, as if searching for an ally, but none came. A middle-aged man with a baseball cap stepped forward. "She's right," the man said, his voice breaking the quiet. "We've got to be better than this." His words seemed to break a spell. An older woman near the frozen foods aisle nodded. "My husband fought in that same war," she said softly, her voice trembling. "He always said the only color that mattered was the red on the flag." The murmurs began to grow. A young cashier, no older than 20, called out from her station, "I've never seen anyone handle something like that so gracefully. Thank you." The elderly woman, now visibly flustered, clutched her cart tightly. She didn't apologize, but the fire in her eyes had dimmed. Her voice, when it finally came, was quieter, almost pleading. "I didn't mean." She started, but stopped herself. Sofia turned back to her, her expression softer now. "It's not about what you meant," she said gently. "It's about how it came across. Words matter. Actions matter even more." A man from the deli counter clapped, slowly breaking the tension. It was hesitant at first, but then others joined in, the sound swelling into something undeniable. People clapped not just for Sofia's words, but for the courage it took to confront hate with dignity. The elderly woman looked around one last time, her face pale, before quietly wheeling her cart toward the exit. As she walked away, a few people moved to comfort Sofia. One woman placed a hand on her shoulder and said, "Thank you for saying what needed to be said." Sofia smiled faintly, lifting her basket back into her hand. "Sometimes," she said, almost to herself, "it's not about winning or losing. It's about making sure people hear the truth." The crowd slowly dispersed, the tension in the air replaced by a sense of reflection. Some looked inspired, others thoughtful, but everyone seemed changed in some small way. The moment had passed, but the impact of Sofia's words was far from over.